The idea of Safety Day really it came from the USPA, from the US Parachute Association. It's a manner in which we can provide information to qualified jumpers. There's a lot of training that we do at centre level, UK level, internationally, for first jump students to get them to a point where they're a qualified solo skydiver. But beyond that, there was certainly a notable gap. And back sort of 15, 20 years ago, it became obvious that they needed more training. It's a great time for a little bit of revision and a little bit of forethought ready for the season. Each year, and we've been running these since back just before I started being chief instructor, so back in 2007, 2008 we started this. Sometimes we do a sort of theoretical food for thought type thing. Previously, in recent years, I've done normalization of deviance, how we get used to making little mistakes. They don't harm us, so we continue doing them because they're easier, and then we have errors creeping in as a result of that. The classic sort of, sign for me, buddy, on the flight line check before they've actually been checked, and then one day they don't get the check afterwards. The signing's already been done, and then people get in an aeroplane with chest straps undone or misrouted parts of their equipment, and the whole thing escalates. And there you get a chain of events, and almost all incidents come from not just a singular event, but actually several little faults along the route that get you to there. I've done things like Bob is dead. We looked at that sort of example there, and then the following year he was revived, and Bob was not dead last year. And then this year we'll go through a few little bits. The other opportunity is it's for you to work with instructors. If there's anything that you want to know, if there's anything that you've got questions about, ask us at lunch, and we'll do an afternoon session where really we just try and cover stuff with you. Basic plan for this morning, I'm going to do a little bit of talking. I'm going to keep it pretty simple this year. And then Nick is going to talk about sort of a generalized incident procedures. Then we tend to do a practical session, which is actual malfunctions. This year we're going to be just actually pulling handles, practice jackets. You can do suspended harness. We'll have quite a lot of staff down there. I've got a few little bits to do as well. Hopefully everyone knows how to undo a slink. So we've got our inaugural Safety Day Slink Challenge. Undo the slink, put it on that end, do it back up properly. Can you do that? And how quickly can you do it? The record amongst the staff already is less than a minute, which was pretty impressive, and it wasn't me. So we're going to work through that. And then broadly this afternoon, we've got the sort of open forum type. People always seem to come up with some questions and sort of ask as we go through the day. More fun, bingo sheets. These are created by Chris and the group there. They don't know what we're going to talk about or I'm going to talk about. So he just imagines what words I'm going to use and then spreads them out across these pieces of paper. So there will no doubt be a prize. I'm sure he's organised prizes for the people that get all of the words. I don't know what's on them, so I'll just be doing my normal spiel. But if you get a word, just cross it off quietly. And
are there any spare cards?
There are.
Can I have one, please?
Looks like there are. It's so popular. Yes, I want a bingo sheet. All right, here we go then. So the aim of today is really to give everyone a chance to refresh some skills, to think about what they need to do in preparation for the new season, and possibly to top up on a little bit of knowledge from a more qualified skydiver point of view, rather than perhaps the student-orientated or focused tuition that you had when you started. It's important that we refresh what we're doing. This is a great time of year to do that so that we are ready for the new season. Bob returns. People seem to like Bob and his escapades. So Bob's been revised again this year. What's Bob been up to? Very simple. Bob this year had his first malfunction. Bob survived, which is unusual for me. Bob normally comes to some kind of woeful ends, but he's actually survived this year, despite rumours that were circulating 2 years ago that Bob was dead. He's actually alive and well. However, he did think he could do things better. He didn't necessarily find his malfunction harder to deal with than he expected, or necessarily easier than expected. But he does wonder if he could have done things better. Did it take him too long to realise what was going on? Did it react in the way he expected? Not necessarily. Malfunctions are very varied in their form, especially if we're jumping a zero porosity canopy, and it can be flying at quite high performance levels. Bob also reflects on how he ended up with a malfunction, as most people do, and it was probably packing. Have we got any students in here? All right. So I will, at some stage, mention that some of this is orientated for the experienced jumpers, and I will try and preempt that. Don't change any of your procedures, and a lot of what we talk about here will also be based on the principle that they're jumping parachutes that are perhaps a little bit more radical for their main parachute. Reserves are pretty inert and pretty much the same, but especially when we start to talk about some other stuff later on, I will try and add a little narrative for you. Don't change anything that you were taught without a direct one-to-one conversation with an instructor. Actually, hopefully, this should be generally consistent. Things like that. Did you train here? So you'll recognise the same stuff we teach students. You know, at the end of the day, what do we want from a parachute? We want a parachute that is functional. It's big. We refer to these parachutes still as square parachutes compared to the round parachutes of military and of olden days. Technically, we're talking about a rectangle. And we want to assess something that is damage free. Basic ideas of the malfunction, consistent with students and very experienced people alike. We need to have a functional and operational parachute. Technically, we'd like that above 2,000 feet. Put us another way, we should never really expose ourselves to the risk of being below 2,000 feet without a parachute that we expect to fly in a safe, normal, controlled way to the ground. And that's where many of the errors creep in as experienced jumpers. Students don't. They look up and go, oh my God, it's nasty, I'm off. And they're under a reserve at 3,000 feet. It's great. Experienced jumpers go, oh, what? No, come on. Really? No, I'm going to sort this out. I can sort this out. I've got it. And then they find themselves, and they're still doing stuff like kicking out twists or trying to resolve the packing error at 1,500 feet. And then the dawn's on, this is not, I'm not winning. Oh, God, look at the height I'm at. And then it all just gets worse. So basic fundamentals, above 2,000 feet, make your assessment, sort it all out, and then you're ready to go. So what's a malfunction? Give me a definition.
Uncontrollable parachute.
Something that's not controllable. Something that we don't have authority over to make it perform in the way we want it to, or at least we need it to as a bare minimum in order to generate a safe landing. Yeah, pretty much. From a recognition point of view, sometimes, most of the time, they're not the familiar square shape, although they can be, but they're not in a position where we have control over it. Example there, student put fingers in ears, twists on a rotating canopy, perhaps with a brake fire. With the student canopy, it doesn't rotate quickly. The human ability to kick those twists out is easy, but there's a point where those two become reversed and the parachute outperforms you as a human, and then twists become a technical malfunction. The canopy will look good, and in fact, half your head is saying, I thought this is just kick them out. But there should be the other half that says, I am not winning here. It's beating me. I don't actually have control. And that's where attitude awareness comes in. Who has malfunctions? Everyone. But actually, the majority of malfunctions occur with qualified jumpers. It's not students that have malfunctions. Statistics are statistics. In the UK, we don't have a massive amount of incidents, fortunately, but it also makes, even just a subtle change, one or two extra, either way, can shift the sort of dynamics of the figures quite quickly. But essentially, last year at Langer, I've excluded tandem here in this set. When Nick does some stats later on, you'll see there is a slight difference in the figures. That's because he's included everything jumping-wise in the UK and at Langer. So last year, we had 35 reserve rides. How many of those were students? 4. All right, so 4, that represents 12%. 88% of our reserve rides last year were generated by qualified, experienced skydivers. Of the static line, or of the students, incidentally, the 4 that we had, 3 had what appeared to be good canopies. The students, they were static line. 1 had twists. They kicked them out, and then for a reason they couldn't be entirely clear with, they then decided to cut away what basically they'd resolved all the problems and then cut it away anyway. And then we had a couple of others where the canopy seemed to be fully open. It was turning fairly steadily. They weren't clear why it was turning. We couldn't see anything from the ground. We know as experienced jumpers that occasionally on opening a parachute will rotate if we were moving around in the airflow during that deployment, and it will tend to steady out afterwards. They responded to that by believing they had a rotating canopy. They cut away. I have no comms with any student that cuts away from anything. If they don't believe that it's a controllable landable canopy, then I have no problems with that at all. We had an entanglement on a free fall jump. First free fall, upside down, parachute round the legs, I think it was. He eventually climbed out of the entanglement, which is the correct procedure, but because he distorted and forced the canopy to deploy in a non-sequential way, he ended up with a line over which he had to cut away from. So they were all fairly minor. And then the experienced jumpers had quite a collection of stuff, which we'll talk about. How often do they occur? Yeah, give or take a little bit. I mean, it varies year to year, and this is where, because our numbers are relatively small, you only need to add 1 or 2 or take 2 away, and it shifts quite a lot. Langer last year, outside of the tandem, our average was about 1 in 880, so just under 1 in 900 jumps. Is that good? It's actually not. It's weaker. We have underperformed relative to the BPA. The BPA last year, again, outside of tandems, they had 203 recorded incidents out of about 200,000 jumps. So their stats are about 1 in 1,000. I've always been proud to say that at Langer, our malfunction and our injury rate tends to be better than the BPA. However, last year, and indeed the year before, we've just slipped a little bit. If we'd have had 5 less mals, then we would have been at or maybe slightly ahead of the BPA average. So you can see it's only small figures, but we were slightly worse than the BPA average.
How does it compare in jump numbers? More jumps here, or?
We were the busiest centre last year in the UK. We had not actually given jump figures from other centres. The BPA correlate them. They have told us that we were the busiest centre last year. Between us and Hib, we're relatively close. The 2 centres that operate at Netheravon, I think collectively do some pretty decent figures as well. So certainly, you take those 3 establishments, we account for routinely around the 90 to 100,000 jumps per year. So we are, those 3 centres, probably 250,000 jumps in the UK. 50,000 of those are tandem, 200 are the others, mainly experienced jumpers. Principal cause of malfunctions? That's it. Yeah. About 80 to 90% of malfunctions here are simply relatively poor packing. As an example of that, we had 5 experienced jumpers last year cut away from canopies that had got step throughs. They packed it with some kind of inversion, some kind of step through the lines. One guy with well over 1,000 jumps open to find a line going round everything else. Proceeded to try and kick the twists out. Clearly wasn't getting anywhere there, and then realised, no, I haven't got twists. Oh, crap. Comments like, I knew something wasn't right when I packed it in my lounge. Pretty much not a full quote, but that was one of them. Yeah, when I put it in the container, all the lines went round the bag and the Pilotchute. So I just pulled the Pilotchute out. I thought it would be all right. Yeah, again, another very experienced jumper. If we'd have just got rid of those 5 silly ones, then we'd have been ahead of the BPA average. What's the chance of our reserve failing? Very small. I've seen a round reserve with the equivalent of a line over, but that's a number of years ago. Imagine it is with a But there are cases where people have deployed reserves, not necessarily in the UK, and found that their reserves have been misassembled. Without a doubt, some of the reserve packers here over the last 20 years have opened kit to find that it wasn't assembled correctly. Dylan opened a few sets of kit a few years ago and found that the slinks weren't done up properly. From a four-way team, four-way group that had, two of them turned around and went, Christ, they were only put together 3 months ago, and two of us have had reserve rides since then. So they got away with it, but we opened one and went, that's not actually attached to the reserve properly. And then we sort of looked at the other three and went, let's just have a quick look at, oh dear. And nothing was assembled properly, but they got away with it. But, the less we use our reserves, I think the safer we are. And that can be important to us. How do we prevent malfunctions? Pack like a pro, not like a idiot. All right. I'm going to do a straightforward malfunction session. One of the stats globally last year was something quite concerning. Generally, you see, let's go back, history. If we talk about the early 90s, most fatalities occurred from what? Anyone have any idea? Hitting the ground, yeah. What was called the low pull or no pull category. All right, people deploying their parachute too low for it to safely operate in time, or simply not deploying their parachute, altitude awareness. All right, that accounted for about 45%. What removed that? AADs. Literally overnight, we saw a decline in that to the extent that when in 2009, the USPA recorded their first year where nobody sat in that category at all. And the modern AAD is purely and 100% responsible for that. I'm a huge supporter of AADs. We are one of the centres where AADs are basically mandatory unless you're doing very high performance canopy piloting where you could accidentally fire it. AADs, in my opinion, have saved a vast number of lives. We are human. We're fallible. We make mistakes. So what took over from that? Well, as soon as AADs came out, 91, 92, 3, we saw the sort of progressive use of AADs. Exactly the same time, people started inventing canopies made out of zero porosity fabric. So we went from jumping F111 porous 170s. Dave Morris had the fastest, zoomiest canopy we had here. It was a 170 called a Wildfire. And I thought, wow, that's really cool. Literally 2 years later, and they're on 135s. And now people are jumping routinely canopies that are 135s and 120s. And we have people here that jump on a continuous basis, and they're down in the sort of 80 square feet sort of range. So the profile of our canopy has changed massively over the next few years, which generated landing injuries. People failing to land a controllable, or landing a parachute but not in a controlled manner, hence the flat and level canopy coming in. And then last year we had an oddity. It's always been a feature. Previous years I've seen figures around the 25-27%, but last year it became the most relevant or the most frequent cause of a fatality. I use USPA figures more than anywhere else because the USPA have a slightly higher jump rate. They do about 3 million jumps. So you tend to see slightly more reliable statistics. What they found was that the biggest incident rate was coming from people that were failing to deal with a malfunction in what I refer to as a timely and controlled fashion. It's got to be on the bingo cards because I mentioned that one. People spending too long analysing, making the mental decision, and then their physical actions were too late or too low to the ground. Or people responding to a malfunction, either correctly or not, but then not acting in the correct manner to that. So examples here are they pull the handles out of sequence, they end up with entanglements with the parachutes, or they have the sort of oddities that can occur that they then respond to in an incorrect way. And the theme there is not always clear, but it often relates to people responding to almost any incident with pull the magic handles, and then they're discovering that that's not an appropriate response. So that stemmed me to lead this way. So Bob's having a malfunction, but he's an experienced jumper this week. So how are we going to deal with it as a pro? All right. 2 types of malfunction. Typically classified: total malfunctions, canopy malfunctions. Total malfunction. Total malfunction, no deployment of the main parachute. What causes a total malfunction? Failure to be able to pull or activate the main parachute. A hard pull. All right, yep. Another one.
Issue with the pilot chute.
An issue with the pilot chute, in what way?
Uncocked or...
Okay, we're going to talk about pilot chute in tow. So this is really the failure to activate that pilot chute at this stage. Physical injury, primarily a dislocation. Yeah, the physical inability to operate the parachute. Hard pull. Failure to find the handle. That can be tied in with just misfortune, dislocation, but it's also often tied in with jumping equipment that you're not used to. Borrowing equipment. We had one a few years ago. She borrowed the kit once. The person whose kit it was it yours? Yes, it was your kit. Yeah. So she very nicely lent to it. Out comes the reserve. Yep. A lack of familiarity with equipment can cause a total malfunction. It might be blue sky, it might be ground, it might be a combination of all of that going on. We'd like to think you're going to remain stable just because you can't find a handle. You're a qualified jumper. Personally, I have never deployed in anything other than a stable configuration. Fingers in ears from student point of view. As experienced jumpers, we should be stable at pull time. Yes, without a doubt, regardless of what's going on, if we're not stable, we should pull anyway. Because actually, stability or the loss of stability and impact at 120 miles an hour, stability is irrelevant. Deploying parachutes saves our lives. But I have this expectation that experienced jumpers should be stable during the deployment phase. Anyway, how do we respond to a total? Operate our reserve. Some people choose the single, just pull the reserve handle. Others will opt towards the one drill fits all, which is what we teach much of the students. Pull the cutaway, pull the reserve. As an experienced jumper, if you change your drills, be very careful. There was an argument 15 to 20 years ago that it is more effective and efficient just to pull the reserve. It could even be said that should you then have a reserve failure, you've still got the option of going back to use the main. Now we're going back 30 years when a guy was saved in the UK. He responded to a total by just pulling his reserve. Unfortunately, when the reserve basically disintegrated on him, he then had the option of going back to use his main, which he did, and he did fairly successfully. It entangled with the reserve, but it put him in a survivable position. There have been cases, at least here I know of several, where in response to a total malfunction, they've gone for the cutaway pad. They've spent so long trying to get the cutaway pad off the Velcro that they've ended up low or an AAD fire. So an element of efficiency can come about by just using the reserve. But the reality is, this is the case when you're falling at 120 miles an hour. Whatever happens, we need to get the reserve out. Respond in a timely fashion comes into play as much as anything else. Experienced jumpers. I'm in free fall. I went for the pilot chute. I couldn't find it. I thought, bugger. So I went for it again. It was definitely not there. In fact, I found the BOC pouch and it was empty. I kept looking. I realised at that point, I only packed the reserve 2 weeks ago and it was a pain in the arse. So I kept looking. How many tries have we had now? That individual, no AAD, quite some time ago, found the bridle line, hauled the bridle line out and ended up with a main deployment. His post-jump response was fairly pale-faced with, I was going in. I was really not thinking about using my reserve. In fact, I was quite dedicated to not using my reserve at this stage because it was a bit of a pain in the arse to pack. You can see how things cascade out of control when, as an experienced jumper, we're comfortable in free fall. we're not responding to this falling at 120 miles an hour with anything other than the normal, hey, this is nice, even though I'm at 2,000 feet, approaching 1,500 feet, and time's evaporating quickly on me. General recommendation, how many attempts? 2, yeah. I've heard people also express the rule of 2s. This process shouldn't take more than 2 seconds. Okay, so the reach, locate, fail to find the handle, have another go, that's it. All right, so generally 2 responses, couple of seconds, 400, 500 feet, that's probably enough then to initiate the mental decision, I need to go somewhere else in terms of deploying a parachute. Pilotchute in tow. Causes? Misrouted bridle, collapsed pilot chute. We haven't cocked our pilot chute, possibly. Some kind of construction rigging failure. Although pilot chutes, if the kill line breaks, for example, the pilot chute will be active anyway. But yeah, often to do with perhaps the container as well, misrouting of the bridle line. We had one pilot chute in tow last year. The person then initiated cutaway in reserve. Reserve opened, the main fell away at that stage. So we don't actually know what generated the pilot chute in tow. Increasingly in the modern world, containers are really tightly wrapped around your parachutes. They're free fly friendly. So the pilot chute has to do more work to extract that parachute. And the result of that, especially when we see people oversizing their main, is just physically the pilot chute doesn't have enough power to extract the main canopy anymore. So they don't actually have anything technically wrong with the kit, except they've put a 170 into a container made for a 150, and then the pilot chute has just got a little bit older. It's not brand new anymore, and the two just no longer function. Pilot chute on a 150 is often slightly smaller than a 170. That's where the border between two different sized pilot chutes come into play. So you could be jumping a small pilot chute, but I've put because that bag lives with that container, but now I've put a 170 in, it'll be fine, I'll just shove it in. The manufacturers don't recommend it, and then they end up with this situation. The worst problem there is that as soon as you open the reserve and the reserve tray can move out of the way, you'll almost immediately get a main deployment as well. Response to a pilot chute in tow. One option is, I wouldn't bother. Let's stop trying to solve problems necessarily. Let's use the reserve. So one option, pull the reserve handle. Another option, cut away and pull the reserve. Endless years of debate amongst experienced jumpers as to how you should respond to this. Personally, and I've had a pilot chute in tow, I could see the pilot chute. I knew it was fully open. It was not cocked. There was definitely a retardation behind me, so something was, in my opinion, firmly attached to me, and it wasn't working. The pin had got caught in the bridle line, so it was stuck in the closing loop. I was sure that my main container was not open, and so I elected just to pull the reserve handle. I was in free fall, cutting away, preempting something that may or may not happen later on. I didn't want to bother with. Also, to be honest, if I'm going to end up with two canopies, I'd rather have the authority of still being connected to my main and have the options of doing something about it. But now we're making decisions in free fall when we're falling very quickly, instead of that one drill fits all, which was the sort of mentality to a lot of emergency procedures, especially when we're taught a student. If we just need to do one drill, we don't have to think. It's acceptable in some ways, and it varies from a BPA standpoint, examiner to examiner, that we regard students as being flawed, less capable perhaps. We try and dumb it down a little bit for them, make it black and white. So the one drill fits all can work for them. But in my opinion, we have to be a little careful with students. They are educated, they are capable, and if they're not educated, we need to educate them. We have the capacity to do that. So discussing these sort of things in far more detail, a student, it's very simple. Follow your emergency procedures, and our emergency procedures is basically that, followed by that. It's simple. They're not having to make decisions about what's actually going on. But you guys do have the ability to see, look, pilot chute's collapsed, all right, Okay, that's probably why. May have a main container open. In fact, probably the pin's out at this stage. So I'm going to end up with 2 out coming up fairly quickly. Fully inflated pilot chute, retardation, probably not coming out. Get the reserve out. And then canopy malfunctions. What causes canopy malfunctions? All packing. It's all packing. Baglock. I've always thought a baglock would be quite interesting. They're fast, apparently. I know Gary Wainwright, Swoop, had one once videoing me and Milko doing an AFF jump. And he looked up and said, it looked like the pictures. It was great. You could have a real multitude of different things. The common thing here, we've moved from being face to earth to in some kind of retarded orientation. You're probably in some sort of upright. When you see video footage on YouTube, you see often the legs are flailing around quite a lot. We teach students to respond to this through their standard emergency drill, cut away and use the reserve. You guys, I'd hook your feet back slightly, try and drop off it into a more face-to-earth orientation. This is quite easy to be, there's a lot of footage of people with baglocks and because of the deployment, they've swung forwards and then they've stayed there. We can push our legs back and roll forwards off it. Probably just amplifies our safety. There's so much YouTube footage of free bags going past camera mounts in that direction. There was quite a few years ago, the bridle line goes around the ring sight. The bridle line of reserve goes around the ring sight on a wingsuiter wearing a wings kit. Not nice, So we can just amplify our safety just a little bit, but obviously just deal with those. Pretty standard stuff. Doesn't look good. Doesn't look nice. These are easy, We don't see people have problems with these, fortunately. They look up. It's not good. It's not pretty. I'm off it. And out comes the reserve. I suppose the temptation historically with the 2 on the left could be pump my toggles, see if I can improve things. Sure, but don't drop into the I'm going to pretend I'm not having a malfunction scenario. Let's make this better because I'm a qualified jumper and I can do that. If you are going to pump the toggles, 2 factors. One is look for an immediate return on your investment. It's got to be getting better as a result of what you're doing. If it's not, just forget it. If you're doing that, what do you got to do with the toggles before you cut away? Stating the obvious, but at least a couple of occasions in the UK I can think of in the last 15 years, people have cut away and found that, whoops, I shouldn't have those in my hands. All right. Years ago on a line over, people would often said, well, pump the toggles, see if you can get if it's a steering line, you might be able to pull it off. I've had one line over, okay, on a tandem, to be fair. I thought, interesting, it's a line over. Took the toggles off, pumped the toggles, and the result was absolutely nothing at all, except I was now going around twice as quickly. I always assumed, and I don't know whether this is true or not, I always assumed that it would turn this way and pivot around the small end. But actually, they tend to turn, with this end being the stable bit, this is the bit that's going round. So actually, my first thought, after swearing to me and the student, was, it's going the wrong way. It's funny how things can... But it's still a line over. Oh, crap, then. So they're pretty simple to deal with. Suggestions on these have changed a little bit over the years. Students, what you can do? Yeah, just get off it. No assessment, no trying to mess around. Experienced jumpers, we used to say, well, you can make an assessment, have I got a landable parachute? Tricky thing here is we're now on canopies that descend more quickly. They have a much more aggressive profile. It's tricky to be able to tell what our descent rate is until the ground's close enough to get that reference, and it's all basically too late from that point of view. I think the more cleverly designed parachutes that we have, zero porosity fabrics, computer design systems, the less happy they are about having chunks missing out of them or broken lines. So if anything, we've started to err slightly with our advice towards pretty much most damage on a high performance zero porosity canopy. You want to be thinking about cutting it away and using the reserve instead. You still have that capacity. You are the pilot. You can still make an assessment, but golden rule here is no distraction, not into the let's pretend I'm not having a malfunction. make the decision early, be altitude aware about what you're doing. We don't want to be making decisions low down. We always want to get rid of everything, get it all sorted by 2,000 feet. Makes sense? Okay, so most of that is pretty familiar, and it isn't that different from our days of being a student. So what other situations can we face? Give us some possible wild examples.
Is it separate to malfunctions?
Well, they're not necessarily the physical shape of the canopies gone wrong. So? Collision, a canopy collision. Okay, yeah, we can have a canopy collision. What else? Broken riser. So physical equipment failure. I haven't written that one down. That's good. What about loss of a handle? Accidental dislodging of a reserve handle during a CF jump. Or accidental removal of a cutaway pad on exit. Yeah. So handle displacement. We had both of those last year. Chest strap undone. Yeah, I suppose that's a sort of, is that an equipment failure or the user interface idiot failure? I don't know. What about things like an entanglement? We shouldn't be unstable on opening, but we could. And what about both parachutes? AAD fire causing both parachutes to open. So there's sort of possibilities that we can face along with physical equipment failure. But we'll see if you can undo a slink and do it back up later on. As well as basic kit care, I suppose that moves into, including altimeter failure and the other bits there. Lost handle placement, that's pretty simple really. Reserve handle missing, we teach the students, canopy, airspace. There's no one going to be around them because we've put them out a long way away from each other, but it's really useful when we're qualified to be checking airspace next. Get all of the toggles, take control, and then the last thing we teach them is to check their handles. And again, that's all about where we're going to be perhaps later on as qualified jumpers. So we shouldn't be dislocating handles after deployment because we should recognise that they've been moved, dislodged and reseat them. Prior to that, obviously, reserve deployment accidentally is unusual, but if you get your foot in someone else's reserve handle doing CF, it's better than kicking them in the head, I suppose. And the cutaway pad, I think, was a 4-way launch that funneled. The guy was completely unaware of the loss of the cutaway pad, and on deployment he had an RSL and a skyhook. So actually he deployed and there was a huh? That's my reserve. Oh, the cutaway pad's gone. Okay, all right. And then he flew it down. Go back 20 years, we had a guy here called John Daisley. He deployed. He said there was a slight thing, and then I was in free fall still. It took a surprising amount of time for him to go, huh? No, I threw the pilot chute. I threw the... he said he went straight for the reserve handle. The cutaway pad was entirely missing, but he made no attempt to locate it anyway, and he ended up underneath the reserve. He didn't have an AAD. This was pre-AAD days as well. So, but he said it took a surprising amount of time from this throw the pilot chute to and then eventually with a reserve. I mean, he was probably 1,000 feet, 800 feet by the time we had a reserve open. So loss of a handle can be a surprise. Without a doubt, RSLs that will pause the main deployment to initiate the reserve deployment definitely help in these situations. Horseshoe. What's a horseshoe? Container open in free fall. Our modern containers are actually really protective against this, although we still see a surprising amount of people snag their containers on the door frame, especially sort of seated exits, climbing out, catching the main flap open, that sort of thing. Preservation in the door is probably important here. If you have a container open in freefall, simple response. Yeah, get everything back in sequence. We're out of sequence right now. What we don't want is a development of this and the bag coming out, although that's less likely with modern kit because it's squeezed in there in a way that it wasn't 20 years ago where the flaps were just sort of fairly open. Throw the pilot chute, get things back in sequence. If the main bag has left the container, where is your pilot chute? It's still in the BOC, but where is the BOC? It's now very mobile. Good exercise when you land is just put your fingers in the BOC pocket with no main in there and move it around. It's actually anywhere from here to up here and all the way around there. It moves around a massive amount. So finding a pilot chute with a container open and the bag has come out for some reason situation could be far more complex. Familiar with your own kit, work out where it could be relative to the lateral, and you're probably going to find it. But it is well worth having a little investigation of that. Entanglements, it's hopefully not likely at all. I can't think of an entanglement with an experienced Well, we're talking about a person entangled in their own parachute system during the deployment. Yes, we see the odd one of these on the progression systems, but not too many. In fact, they're very rare, fortunately. Entanglements are super easy. If you're entangled with your main parachute, get rid of it. Get rid of the entanglement. You know, if it's around your arm, get it off your arm. If it's around your leg, get it off your leg. I've dispatched a 5-second delay. She ended up with 2 entanglements. Her leg she was completely upside down. I remember first thinking, God, thank God the chest strap's done up tight. But she ended up with one foot in one set of lines and another foot in another set of lines, and it looked absolutely horrendous. At the point where you dispatch, head up, go, left, Ange, go left, go left. And everyone's looking out the window going, hello, this is going to be, oh yeah, the plane's going around. Oh my God. 6 seconds, she had a perfect canopy. Yeah, she was upside down, canopies rotating in this whole horrific mess. She just went, okay, entanglement drills, follow that, foot out. Oh yeah, okay. Other foot, yep, swung underneath. She didn't even have a pack rotation or anything. I said, oh, did you have some twists in the run? She said, no, perfect canopy. Less, 6 seconds at most. And I thought, goes to show that entanglement drills really work. If you have an entanglement, actually be quick about it, be effective, but check your altimeter above 2,000 feet, try and clear the entanglement. Check the altimeter again, try and clear the entanglement. General advice, if we get to 2,000 feet and are unable to clear the entanglement. Yeah, we actually here, and this is open to debate amongst yourselves, we just opt for pull the reserve handle. 2 features here. Firstly, we can't believe that cutting away will provide the normal process. It's not going to get rid of the main parachute, allowing open space to the reserve. If it's caught around our leg, and I've spent maybe a minute trying to get it off my leg and I failed, pulling the cutaway pad will not do anything mythical or magical like dissolve the lines and get rid of it. It's still going to be there. I've lost any lift or support that it was generating for me, and therefore I'm now falling. If I'm falling that way, with one riser has come off me, it's flapping around up there, a mess of lines and fabric, and then whatever is caught around me, that's pretty much in the same location that my reserve is now going to try and deploy through or past. If we retain the main, probably with the rotation that is being generated by the misshapen canopy, there's more likelihood of a canopy, me being thrown around, the reserve being passed in that direction and actually creating separation. If we then end up with a good reserve, we can opt perhaps to assess whether cutting away the main becomes viable, whether we can climb out of the entanglement now the tension's been removed, but we've put ourselves in a slower speed, more survivable position. Probably thinking more than we'd like you to think as a student. It's super simple for you. Try and get out of it, 2,000 feet, pop the reserve handle out. Anything subsequent to that is probably survivable. We don't necessarily expect your main to be doing the kind of things that some of these guys' mains will be doing, which is, fighting them still potentially. Okay, and the last one, deployment of both canopies. All right, what causes that? low pull associated with an AAD fire. Yeah, that's the most common cause. 20 years ago, we probably didn't really see much of this 20, 30 years ago. And now it's slightly more common. We had one last year. I think we had, I've seen quite a few over the various years. And they're generally associated with a low pull. And the low pull comes from something else. Last year's was essentially a stiff pull. Again, comments like, I thought it was going to be a stiff pull before I got in the plane. Followed by probably 3 or 4 attempts, the last of which was successful, not dealing with that situation in a timely and controlled fashion, resulted in the AAD fire. Then we had 2 out. Similar scenario, a couple of years ago, person who used a ripcord system at another centre, been converted to throwaway at the other centre, came here to visit, first jump here, reached for the Pilotchute, deployed, nothing was happening, still nothing happening, that's a bit strange. Okay, emergency procedures, I can't get hold of the cutaway pad, I don't understand why I can't get hold of the cutaway pad, oh my god, the ground's getting really close, I better pull the reserve handle. Okay, reserve's open, brilliant. I've got the Pilotchute in my hand. That's why it didn't open. Oh, I don't need that. Oh, hold on a minute. Oh, I've got 2 parachutes now, and I really don't know what to do. And actually, possibly one of the more sensible things he said at that point, he said, what I did was, that was nice. It was a field, so I kind of went, because I didn't want to balls things up anymore. And he had a very pleasant landing and came back and explained this to us. Yes. So these things do happen, and they're symptomatic of failures earlier on. Guy learning head down. Didn't hear his audible. Bit late, therefore. Looked at the ground and thought, whoo, that's a little close. So he went flat straight away. He checked his altimeter. I don't know why I checked my altimeter, because I knew the ground was really close. Anyway, my altimeter said 1,500 feet, so I knew, yes, I was really close to the ground. Then I waved off, he said. Anyway, and then I deployed the reserve. Deployed the main. His AAD had also fired very, very close to that. He ended up with them one in front of each other. And likewise, he said, I had absolutely no concept of what to do at this stage. So I kind of just left them to it, and he landed safely as well. So it's a collection of things that lead to this. But yes, we can abruptly say failure to operate the main parachute in a timely way, a low deployment for whatever reason, AADs pop in there and operate the reserve. But we could also say I threw the Pilotchute, I had a Pilotchute in tow, I responded to that by operating my reserve, and then subsequently had a main deployment because the disturbance of the reserve deployment removed whatever was snagging the main. What do we do if it happens? The answer to this is that we should all know this. There's a chuckle from the back. The answers to this came about in a report 22 years ago. I was amazed when I was writing this that it's 22 years since the Dual Square report came out. I am just so excited to talk about the Dual Square report. I love it. It's 11 pages long, and it just tells you why these things occur almost all the time. It's undoubtedly on your bingo cards, because year after year after year I talk about the Dual Square, and I haven't spoken about it for about 4 or 5 years. So it's great to come back to an old friend. The revolution about this was that it cleared up so many myths and mistruths and just simple rubbish that people used to come up with. And it said the likelihood, there are rules. There are things that will happen because of what's sort of happened beforehand, whether the main's open first and the reserve. It tells us pretty much everything that we need to know about dealing with our parachute. And we can now go downstairs afterwards and look at our own parachutes and say, oh, okay, so if this occurs, if I open my main first, then my reserve, this will happen. Or if I do it the other way around, this will happen. Or you can find out really easily. One of the first things they concluded was use compatible equipment. Choose canopies that are not drastically different in size. So as a general rule of thumb, you want them to be relatively similar in size. That's all about what they found in terms of compatibility. And that came into play because what they then found was that the bigger, the longer the lined canopy was the dominant one. So they found that if the top of the canopy that was at the back was below the trailing edge like that, so the shorter canopy was at the back, the dominant canopy, the longer lined one was at the front, they'd stay that way. That's called a biplane. If they did it the other way around, if they put the longer dominant canopy, longer lined canopy at the back, then it would push itself round to the side and you'd have a side-by-side. They concluded that very, very easily. Dominant canopy, they talk about line length. They did these using zero porosity mains as well as a variety of F111, Furies and various other bits, but a lot of them were done with sabres and PD reserves. PD were heavily involved in these tests. It is probably a good idea to generate or have a parachute system where the main is the dominant canopy. Students, all of our kit is designed and configured so that the main is the dominant canopy. So when we go to these rules, you're going to be more familiar with them than most of these people. All right. So work out for your kit which is the dominant one. It isn't purely size driven. 7 cells have slightly smaller lines. Reserves typically are slightly smaller lined. Now they use an example here of a stiletto. So we're a bit old school, but it applies to a Sabre 2 or anything else. So for example, a PD143 as a reserve, although it technically is a bigger canopy, it actually has shorter lines than a stiletto 135. So they are what I'd regard as a compatible setup. The main will be the dominant one in this situation. And it's super easy to work out and find out which will be. And general advice is consider having the main as the dominant canopy, especially as we move into, the ZP world. Even Sabres were F111 canopies made out of ZP pretty much. They were the same shape. The lines were all the same length. Time has progressed and we now have more tapered canopies. The center lines may be the same length as each other, but the outer lines are different. The trim of a canopy has moved on. And so the mains have got higher in performance and sophistication. So definitely, I think more so than when this report was generated, having the main as the dominant canopy is fairly important.
Even when you get to the highest performing ones?
Well, then you start getting a disparity between the sizes. If you're on a layer 83 and a Optimum 106 or something, then expect more exciting times than the rules still apply, but the stability of them is probably less likely. Primary conclusion, the most likely configuration from a simultaneous or near simultaneous deployment is a biplane. The main is in the front. The taller canopy is in the front, the shorter reserve is in the rear. And this was the most common result by far. How do we respond to this? Steer the main. Yeah. They recommend that you use the steering toggles, even with a very small layer and Optimum or PD reserve or something. I think we're probably in a fairly stable condition here. By releasing the brakes, we are allowing a little bit more energy into the system, but at the same time, we have a little bit more authority and can be a little bit more controlling of what's happening with the main parachute. It's pretty robust, lots of physical contact, structurally very solid. We can fly this in a nice controlled way. Landing? PLF. General recommendation in terms of what are we doing with our main toggles? Yeah, that's the general conclusion. They did find that, so you're flying along, you flare, you pull the back end down, it gets retarded, we swing forwards, we force it into an uphill climb, lift effect that we expect with a flare. That rotation can't happen because it's being bulldozed along by the reserve behind it. So actually all you're doing when you're flaring in this situation is distorting the shape of the main. It did, in some cases, generate a slightly improved landing, but it had to be so precise with the timing. Their conclusion was actually, and in particular they make a comment about the propensity of students to mistime their flare. They actually found that the conclusion was it is better simply to allow the parachute to do what it's normally doing and just to do a PLF. It actually included flaring. Not flaring is a better idea. And there's footage of this when they actually did some of the tests, and the guy just stands and takes a few paces forwards. All right. What not to do? Don't cut it away. And an interesting, I'd forgotten that one. When they did intentional cutaways as part of their tests, they had an entanglement with the reserve 11 out of 11 times. So I think that's fairly conclusive. All right. The main, when they cut it away, entangled with the reserve on every of the 11 times that they did. Now, in some of those, it subsequently cleared, but in others, it didn't. I mean, these guys were using 3 and in some cases 4 parachutes to do these tests. And they ended up in some pretty messy situations, as I understand it. So we can go from 2 parachutes that are lovely and functional to essentially no parachutes that are stable and flying. So here's a classic example where one drill fits all does not fit all. In fact, categorically, going through our emergency procedures here could have catastrophic effects. So if they're one in front of each other, and that's what we had last year, just fly it. How this generally occurs is this is a main deployment first, followed by the reserve. So the example we had last year, the guy having a total, repeatedly tried to deploy the main. He successfully deployed the main, but the AAD intervened and also caused the reserve to come out afterwards. And so the reserve popped up behind. The next most common configuration is a side-by-side. The main rises behind the reserve. Rises. A personal side-by-side was the result of the taller of the 2 canopies deploying behind the shorter one. So essentially what we're talking about here is a reserve deployment first, followed by the main deployment. Less common because that sequence tends to be less common. Really, examples here are I had a Pilotchute in tow, popped the reserve out, the main subsequently deployed afterwards because it was freed from whatever was trapping it in there. All right, some kind of, or we have our example of our guy who forgot to throw the throwaway. He opened the reserve and then subsequently let go of the main Pilotchute and had a main Pilotchute deploy the main afterwards. Side by side. Fly the taller dominant canopy again. Fly the main. Super small, super whizzy. The general recommendation, as per this report, was to use the steering toggles. And that's exactly what we teach the students. They've got 2 very compatible, very similar in performance main and reserves. As we get to the extremes, and we're down in the very high performance mains, there could be an argument to say that if they are flying in a compatible way with the brake set, just leave them as they are. There is no need to start adding more energy by releasing the brakes on the main parachute. But that depends on, you've got to get to the more extreme end of things. Or be grossly different with the sizes. You know, have a very large reserve, let's say a 120, a 135. I say very large, but compared to your, Valkyrie 84, it is large and draggy. And so essentially you can expect these to be compatible in almost all cases, unless we're at the pointier end of the CP canopies. Normally operate the main toggles, fly with an element of sensitivity. It is less stable than the one in front. They can get a little bit twitchy if you are a little overexcited. I think with the biplane, you've probably got lots of authority. I can go and land wherever I want. In this situation, more like, well, I'd like to face into wind and that's a nice field. I'm just going down there rather than let's do a quick 360 to have a look around. I think we just want to keep it super simple. Less energy, less return feedback and problems coming to get you later on. So pretty much fly the main, but be sensitive about what you're doing. If not, just use the risers, but use the risers on the dominant canopy, which will be the main. There's all sorts of wonderful myths that used to be attached to this. Landing. Yeah, you don't want to be doing anything funky like flaring. And in fact, if you've got the steering toggles in your hand, just be careful, because a large part of your subconscious brain will be going, flare! And you've really got to think, no, I don't know, hold the harness. I don't know how to get around that, but do something consciously to think, don't do it. Don't do it. Richard, don't do it. Oh, he's flared, bang. All right, so try not to put yourself in that situation.
With 2 canopies out there, will you be coming down slower?
I don't think there's a lot in it. You haven't gained lots of efficiency. A canopy is designed to be here, push it over to there, and put another one here. And actually, the prime lifting space is sort of just the end cell. So I think you're talking about potentially twice the surface area of canopy flying, but it is less effective. Maybe they're not quite, there's a little bit of inefficiency. Pictures of these landing, you tend to see people sort of just sliding over onto their side or slipping over. It doesn't look, hugely tiptoey and pleasant, but it doesn't look anything other than, they just slide nicely on the ground and they get up and go, okay. So it doesn't need to be too complex. Use slow and smooth, gentle inputs. More importantly, what not to do? Yeah. On one such test jump, the test jumper tried to flare with all 4 toggles, which immediately turned the 2 canopies into a nose-to-nose fighting match. I love this. This was not a desirable result. In addition, flaring with the outside toggle of each canopy to turn it into a downplane. This was not a desirable result. And these are the myths that were all there, 2 out. I know people, students that were taught many years ago, not necessarily here, that it's with the outside riser and outside riser to pull the canopies, and this debunked all of that almost straight away and said, don't do that, it's not a good idea. It must be stressed, only fly the front or the larger dominant canopy in a dual square scenario. That was one of the most important sort of conclusions that they had. Other options. Cutting away from a side-by-side, student goes like this at this stage, because we're definitely not going out. We know that your canopies will fly together nicely. All right, they are just boxy, pleasant things to stick next to each other, and if we all jump them, we'd be probably a lot safer. Other options. Cutting away from a side-by-side seems to be a safe action as long as no equipment problems exist and the canopies are not entangled. Reserves open first, mainers come out afterwards. Risers to the main are sat behind the reserve risers. Great caution must be used when cutting away in a scenario due to the varied styles and applications of RSLs, and that's what they mean by equipment problems. I like the fact that we are increasingly seeing people with RSLs and skyhooks. There is no doubt that over the years the lack of an RSL has created more issues and more incidents than an RSL. Late deployment of reserves following a cutaway, people cutting away, trying to get stable, even people with many jumps, world champions, cut away, failure to locate the reserve handle. I can't cut away, bring the hand across, cut away. Unfortunately, the reserve handle was no longer there. Failure of an emergency procedure. I won't name the individual, but basically they've got 2 pads. And instead of peel, punch, they don't know why. They'd gone, peel? Oh, crap. At which point this one that had already peeled decided it was going to bugger up around the back of the harness and disappear back there. So once they'd done that, they cut away high enough to fall, get really scared, and then their AAD intervened. But they were unable at any stage to locate the reserve handle, and they were not equipped with an RSL. But in this situation, we do have the option generally, but you don't, to disconnect your RSL. Static line kit, the RSL is permanently shackled to stop them disconnecting it at any stage. We want to know that if they pull the cutaway pad, the reserve's coming out from the RSL. But on our equipment, we do have the capacity. I'm always slightly sceptical. I know our brain loves plan A. It would be so nice just to have a lovely reserve and I could fly it confidently down to the ground and all this lot. So I want to get rid of this main. But actually, if the main's not causing you bother, and this goes back to, I'm probably better off doing this and just going, ground please. If I'm going to survive right now, I'm probably better off surviving than trying to get back on plan A using our knowledge and experience. If you're going to cut away, personally, this says yes, it may be seems safe as long as equipment problems don't get in the way. Yeah, it probably will clear, maybe it'll clear. I'm just a little uncomfortable with the idea of taking something that probably is survivable right now and pushing yourself into a situation that isn't. And then lastly, less frequency occurrence is a downplane. Personal downplane was rare, but valid. It always involved line twists due to a tumbling bag on deployment of the main canopy when it was the second to deploy. So actually, you've got to go through several links in the chain to generate a downplane. Canopies are not always trying to mess you around. So what you've got here is a reserve deployment. The main comes out, drops away, bag's twisting and turning. You end up with twists in the main. So the reserve's open, main comes up with twists. In most cases, what started out as a downplane would quickly evolve into a side-by-side with no input. See so few of these. Ironically, actually, the one I always remember is the reverse to that. We had a student on 10-second delays, she pulled low. The reserve was open first through the AAD firing. The main dropped out, as you'd expect, about that angle, tumbled. The main opened, so she got the reserve. The main came up, and because it had twists, the main would slowly turn away, and she'd push into a downplane, and then the twist would come out, and the canopy would come back, and then it would try and take the next twist out and come back. And it eventually got to the point where it only got a few twists left, but there wasn't obviously enough driving force now just to finish it off. So it actually then just sort of stuck in a downplane. And she was going down fairly quickly. It was getting a little low. She was down there inside the airfield. And she cut away, which she could not have timed in any other way other than the perfection that she did. As she cut away, her reserve, she was into wind. Her reserve into wind. Her feet at about this level went through the grass. And she stood up. If she'd have cut away 2 feet lower, I think it would have been messy. If she'd have cut away 4 foot lower, I'm not sure she'd have survived. So, yeah, she just cut away. She was in a downplane at probably 50 foot. And when she cut away, she just went... And all of us here just went... I'm wearing a microphone, so I'll be careful what I say. But, yeah, we were impressively stunned and relieved. Twists in the main. You know, the main is trying to do something. It's forcing itself away. But obviously, we have the option here to do what? Cut away. And on our modern kit, before we cut away, disconnect the RSL. Yeah? We need to cut away. Disconnect any RSL. Cut away the main canopy. Again, not for the students.
Why are we disconnecting RSL from reserves anyway?
Why are we disconnecting it? We've got a lanyard that is, about that long, connected to our main parachute. When I cut away my main in this situation, I want it to go away. Last thing I want is any part of it tethered to me. Now, okay, it's possibly a strip of Velcro or some tuck flaps. The reserve's already open, so any skyhook or any other complication back there has probably been disconnected. But you've still got a lanyard that is essentially this long, more than likely stuck to you with a bit of Velcro. Now, if it's peeling off in the direction it expects from a normal cutaway, it just peels off the Velcro on a vector, I'm thinking of more than anything. But if you are trying to pull it in that direction, even a strip of Velcro this long, basically pulled in that direction, it's sheer, it's extremely strong. And what's possibly going to happen is I cut away and I find that this riser is still attached to me. I've now got a massive flag off this shoulder, and I'm trying to fly my reserve in a straight line, and what's going to happen is I'm going to be pulled around. So it's a little tag, pop it off. Try it. Again, have a competition. Land, flare, how quickly can you check that everything's safe for you to do this exercise and get your RSL undone? Maybe. Try it in the hangar. The little bits like this that we can do to just help ourselves.
Isn't there a contained design as well? Is it the racer?
Yeah.
Dual RSL, and you have to disconnect it, otherwise it'll kill you.
Yeah. Sort of, yeah. I mean, a racer has an RSL that goes from here and then both around the back in a loop, so that both risers have to leave before you get a reserve deployment. And atoms are similar. Atoms have 2 pins, one connected to the left riser, one to the right, so that if a riser breaks, it won't generate a reserve deployment until the other riser has departed. But with the racer in particular, if you have a Pilotchute in tow, it specifically says just pull the reserve. You must not cut away. So there was a guy, he responded to a Pilotchute in tow with his normal drills. The reserve opened, and then as the main came out, because it was not connected to him, but with this whatever shape RSL, I think it goes up the lines and chokes your reserve off, which it did. He survived, I think, or did he? Yeah. It wasn't great. It's just read the manual. So there are oddities with complex RSLs, which actually we don't see necessarily. But I would disconnect anything that's tethering in my main to me. Last little bits for dual square, but we don't really see this. Trailing equipment, well, unless they're doing CF. In some cases, the jumper found with one sort of partially open canopy, they found it easy to pull the Pilotchute in, or even the Pilotchute bag and lines, but great caution must be done, however. If the canopy gets into the airstream, it could inflate and rapidly get out of control. We don't recommend pulling in an inflated or partially inflated parachute. Even the bagged canopy is dangerous. And on one test jump, the guy pulled the sort of partially inflated canopy and was containing it. It came free from him just prior to landing as he was turning into wind, and he ended up with a personal downplane and was injured. So if you've got stuff, you can either collect it in and make sure it's super secure. You might even want to think about, I've got time here, I'm going to disconnect my RSL, I'm going to take the cutaway pad out and just open the 3 rings up so that if it goes free, it's not going to be round me, it's stowed in from behind, and then it's going to drop away. Or getting rid of it during your flight. But again, making sure that you've taken action to prevent any risk of it deploying and getting worse. What else do we teach students? Canopy collisions and low cutaways. That's really another lesson, but I have a canopy collisions lesson. Canopy collisions are one of those things that can defy the 2,000 feet rule, because we could have a canopy collision below 2,000 feet. So actually we could apply that rule, go below 2,000 feet with a parachute that we expect to be safe to land and control, and then have a canopy collision at low level. Our advice to students, first thing, check canopy. If you've got a good canopy, that's about it really, stick with it. You may want to provide assistance to the person that is collided with you. If you do not have a good canopy, altitude awareness becomes key. We teach the students that if they're above 1,000 feet, an option to cut away is available to them, but they've got to believe that they're going to be free and clear to do so. Anything below 1,000 feet, they're just to pop the reserve out, which is the preventative measure for low cutaways. How long does a reserve take to open is a common question from students, and the answer is we just don't know. It depends on your body position, the speed you're moving, the type of parachute, your weight, humidity, air pressure. Height above sea level has a notable effect on reserve on deployment speeds of parachutes. So there's so many factors we don't know. I remember reading an article a very long time ago that said any cutaway below 500 feet should be deemed to be unsuccessful. Well, that was a great way of putting it. So there's, and we know that if we cut away at 2,000 feet, our chances of survival are really quite good. And somewhere in between there's a zone where it gets a little hazy. So our advice to students is don't cut away below 1,000 feet. I personally have kit fitted with a skyhook. And for those of you that want to know what a skyhook is, if you don't, see us separately. But basically the main speeds up the deployment of the reserve when you cut away. I tell you what, 1,000 feet, it'd be pretty low to be thinking about cutting away. You've got to be fairly sure that everything's going to function exactly in the way it should do. I mean, even flying around under canopy at 2,000 feet, if you look down, you think, a bit close to the ground here, and yet I've been in free fall below that with a total malfunction. So we talked to them that. Conclusion: pack a good canopy. If we had good packing, I think we'd probably have 8 or 10 malfunctions a year. Open at the correct height. That makes a big difference. Gives you time. And look after yourself. Your parachute is the thing that saves you every time you jump out of an aeroplane.